From now until June, I'm going to be focusing sermons on what we believe. I don't mean I'm going to be spouting Christian doctrines and saying those are things that you have to believe, because I think that's a destructive approach to faith. Real faith is not something external that imposes itself on us. If you took the 6 years of all my sermons at Crawford to date and fed them into the AI chipper, a common theme that would spout out would be the point that faith, as portrayed and encouraged in the Old and the New Testaments, is not coercive. The Israelites even had a choice about whether they wanted to be governed by the Ten Commandments or not, a choice they had to make at two separate points along their journey in the wilderness. When Christians coerce others to adopt faith, which we have sadly done in various places and times for millennia, that is a grave departure from what the Bible teaches. And atrocity inevitably ensues. And we will get to all that more along the way. But here at the outset, I want to assure you that's not what this sermon series is about. These weeks are about helping each of you individually and all of us collectively to be able to both recognize and articulate whatever it is we already believe. While the church may want to hear people say, "I believe in Jesus," to become a member, there are as many ways to interpret what it means to believe in Jesus as there are people to profess it. Lent is a time to look inward, and defining those things for ourselves is the goal. As we do that, you may find that along the way, things that you always believed in some sense are suddenly kind of on the rocks, which can be very unsettling. And that's fine. You are not in trouble. There are entire church movements going on as I speak about deconstructing and reconstructing faith. I think that is a good and necessary step to making a faith that perhaps you were born into and just sort of absorbed by osmosis, your own, which is the goal here. To understand what each of us in our heart of hearts actually believes. Another thing that would come out of that AI chipper of my sermons is that I very much do not care what you don't believe. A faith that is empty of content is of zero interest to me. I would much rather have you tell me that you firmly believe Jesus was a space alien who came to Earth during the Pleistocene, was frozen into ice, discovered during the building of the pyramids, and thawed by space lasers in the 1st century, than to tell me I don't believe in virgin birth. We can have a conversation about a positive belief. And I would certainly be interested in how you sourced the information on the Pleistocene. But more importantly, I want to help each of us understand how the beliefs that we hold impact our lives, our relationships, and our well-being. Not believing in the virgin birth, for example, is a non-starter, very literally. It doesn't go anywhere except to a Monty Python-esque, yes she was, no she wasn't, yes she was, no she wasn't. But what you can do is turn that into a positive belief and thereby start to get the ball rolling. Tell me who you think Mary was, not who she wasn't. What were her circumstances in your mind? If you believe she's a fictional character, then tell me that. And we can talk about how you view the stories where she appears, whether you feel a connection to her in those stories, and what they may or may not have to teach us in these times. Same for, well, I don't believe in the Bible. That is, to me, a lazy position. What do you mean by that? We've got Bibles here in every pew. Do you believe they don't exist? Do you not see words on the pages? Where do you think they came from? A lot of people who say they don't believe in the Bible, and as the head of a Bible society for 13 years, I have spoken to many, they're really referencing a very specific set of beliefs taken from biblical passages, often taken out of context, and used in ways that a person has found harmful or offensive. That's the kind of movement that I'm looking for, to get us actively engaged in our own faith. Don't just kick the can and say, I don't believe that. Fine, I don't care. What do you believe? The things we do believe are the things that affect how we live and move in the world. The things we do believe shape our lives and the lives of those around us. And that impact, from person to person and the communities that those groups of persons then form, was what mattered to Jesus, and that is what matters to me. In moving from what we don't believe to what we do believe, we can stop checking our brains at the door of the church and begin to have real conversations. We can come to understand each other, even when the content of our beliefs is miles apart. And if a bit of doubt and humility around your own beliefs stops you from bombing another country, so much the better. The passage Neil read from John 3 for our text this morning happens to be the lectionary text for today. Surprise, surprise. And I went with it because it's a great example of someone in the Bible trying to sort out his own beliefs. It's also a great example of how single verses of the Bible can sort of march off and take on lives of their own, outside of the original context, and become doctrines forced on others. Like many Protestants in my generation, we had to memorize Bible verses in Sunday school. And John 3:16 was one of the first we learned. I probably knew it by heart in second grade. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish but have everlasting life. We hear that verse today with over 2,000 years worth of baggage attached to it. In the year 325, the bishops at the First Council of Nicaea spent 3 whole months just trying to figure out what the word begotten meant. And I don't think that what they came up with in the Nicene Creed is terribly helpful in moving that conversation along. And what does it actually mean to believe in Jesus? There's virtually nothing in that famous verse that provides definition of any of those terms. Everlasting life to the Jews of the first century was a very different concept than what has come to us after having been wandered through Greek philosophy. And the other part of this dialogue between Jesus and Nicodemus that gets thrown around like a wild game of Calvin ball is this born again phrase. A bit of word study and glance at the notes in most Bible translations indicate that the Greek words for born again in that verse can also be translated in English as, in the translation Neil read from, as born from above. And that's fine, although Nicodemus's follow-up indicates that he heard born for a second time. But what does either of those things mean? Let's look at the bigger context. In verse 1, we learn that Nicodemus is a Pharisee and that he was a leader of the Jews. Too many Christians equate Pharisees with the bad guys in the New Testament, and that is not so. The general population in Israel in Jesus' day were typically fans of the Pharisees. They were the practical teachers who could explain and interpret the law of Moses that most people couldn't read for themselves or figure out how to apply in their current circumstances. The law of Moses was already 2,000 years old by the time of Jesus. A good and necessary role in a religious society. So Nicodemus is a Pharisee, but not all Pharisees would also be described as, quote, a leader of the Jews. That extra phrase here means Nicodemus was a member of the Sanhedrin, the political group in Israel that served as the nation's supreme court. Both Pharisees and Sadducees, who were the priests serving in the temple and other shrines, were on the Sanhedrin. And Nicodemus was a member of that august body. So verse 1 establishes that Nicodemus is a widely respected scholar with skills that also put him in a position of power in Israel's government. Verse 2 tells us that Nicodemus came to Jesus by night. And that carries the exact implications that you would think. Nicodemus did not want to be observed visiting Jesus. Pharisees who wanted to take Jesus on in religious debate do so many times in the Bible, and they do it quite publicly, where both onlookers and Jesus' disciples could hear it. Why is Nicodemus coming at night? Context. Remember that the Bible was not written with chapter and verse divisions. Those were added in the Middle Ages. The event that John's gospel puts right before this encounter, which we only see as distinct because somebody in the Middle Ages stuck a chapter 3 in between it, is the event that the other 3 Gospels put in the last week of Jesus' life, but John puts at the beginning, the time Jesus heads into the temple, makes a whip, and does his best Indiana Jones interpretation with the money changers in the temple. Needless to say, that was not something that went over well with the religious authorities. And Nicodemus was a religious authority with a role in the government. Jesus was publicly challenged in that moment in the temple, which you can read in chapter 2. But immediately after that, Nicodemus comes to Jesus by night. A different Pharisee might have come at night with a dagger, but not Nicodemus. He's no doubt troubled by what had just happened in the temple. But he's also curious, and he's trying to figure out exactly who he's dealing with and why Jesus is doing what he's doing. Likely because he expects to be dealing with the fallout in his day job on the Sanhedrin and wants to get it right. But there's also an indication that he's coming representing others who have similar questions. Maybe they cast lots to see who would sneak out to question Jesus in the middle of the night. But note that Nicodemus doesn't ask his question in the first person. He doesn't even start with a question. He starts by indicating that he's not, in fact, coming with a dagger. He addresses Jesus with respect as a rabbi and says, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one can do these signs that you do apart from the presence of God." So Nicodemus, and whoever else is included in "we" in that first statement, who are likely also members of the Sanhedrin, have recognized already that God is with Jesus. They may not yet be Jesus' followers, but neither are they hostile to him. They are Jesus curious. And in verse 3, Jesus returns the affirmation and respect for Nicodemus when he says, "Very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God without being born again." Jesus is essentially saying that Nicodemus just made that affirmation and has been able to recognize God's work in him precisely because Nicodemus himself has had a spiritual birth. But Nicodemus, a scholar used to parsing every word of the law, stumbles on that born-again language. Given how things began in the conversation, I think Jesus may have been a bit taken aback by someone as well-trained as Nicodemus taking born again literally. And so Jesus patiently explains, no, a grown man is not going to be crawling back into a physical birth canal. We're talking about a spiritual birth here. We're born first of the waters of the womb, and then we are metaphorically born a second time when we discover that life has spiritual dimensions. This blows Nicodemus's mind, and he says, how can these things be? And Jesus seems to suddenly realize that he has his work cut out for him when he responds, are you a teacher of Israel, and yet you do not understand these things? Jesus might have expected that from those who had never studied, who maybe lived a subsistence lifestyle and were understandably focused only on what they could see and hear and touch. But Nicodemus, the highest levels of religious learning and authority, can't recognize a metaphor when they hear one? The ones charged with teaching everyone else about the God of Israel and ruling on the teachings of others can't even grasp the concept of spirit? Yikes. Now, we could go on through the rest of the section, which has interesting debate around the actual text, since punctuation isn't in the earliest manuscripts either, and John provides special challenges in determining where exactly Jesus starts and stops speaking and what is John's commentary on that. And it's interesting to note the effect of this discussion on Nicodemus when he appears twice more in later places in John's Gospel, and we will get to those places next week. In this first direct encounter, we're looking at how Nicodemus tries to figure out what Jesus is actually teaching and what he, Nicodemus, thinks about that. His first instinct is to take his words literally, which Jesus rejects outright. Jesus responds with a whole section on flesh and spirit and how it's necessary to be born both of those ways, through the waters of the womb as a human, but also to have a spiritual birth, which can happen at any time thereafter. But the question Jesus leaves hanging in the air is how such a spiritual birth comes about. We understand, at least in general terms, how human birth comes about. But how does one experience a spiritual birth? How do we know such a thing has happened to us or to anyone else? Most of Christianity has been filled with the wide variety of answers to those questions. Beliefs about what a spiritual birth requires, the signs that accompany it or don't, whether it's limited to people of one particular religion or to any religion at all, whether a spiritual birth is the same thing as salvation, and it goes on and on and on. Jesus doesn't answer those questions here. And we have to search out each piece of it in other places in the Bible. We'll be thinking about that puzzle and its perils as we move through Lent and beyond. But a key thing about the beliefs in any religious system is that they are intertwined with other beliefs in an attempt to make the whole system function as a cohesive whole. Complicating matters, different traditions within Christianity have put those systems of connected belief together in different and sometimes conflicting ways. So as we sit with the questions about what might constitute a spiritual birth and how someone might get there, next week we will tack on one of the connected questions about the relationship between belief and action, and faith and works. You can expect the book of James to make an appearance next week, even if someone is dropping nuclear warheads by then, because war and corruption and cruelty in every shape and form come from beliefs that have gone off the rails. And if we want to prevent them, or at least some of them, understanding how what we believe is connected absolutely to what we do gives us the path to do something about it.